Okay, lesson 1.3, day 2, midpoint and bisector. All right, so fill these in. A midpoint, as it suggests, is a point that divides a segment into two congruent segments. So if we're talking about congruent, remember our symbol for congruency, okay? A bisector, a line, a ray, or a segment that intersects a given segment at its midpoint. My pen doesn't want to work. To bisect, if you think of bisecting, it cuts it in half. Okay, so a bisector and a midpoint work hand in hand. A perpendicular bisector would be a line, ray, or segment that intersects the segment at its midpoint, the same definition as above. But if it's a perpendicular bisector, it has to be perpendicular to the segment. Okay, so again with notation, recall perpendicular lines. Perpendicular lines are two lines that intersect at a right angle. We need the box when we represent that, and the symbol for perpendicular would look like an upside down T. Okay, so a midpoint, a point that divides a segment into two congruent segments. So here we are, K, M, redo this. Okay, so I'm going to put my point in the middle. We'll make our midpoint B, so we don't always associate it with M. Now, if it intersects it into two congruent segments, remember the markings for congruency. I would say KB is congruent to BM. So that figure, putting those marks on there, tells me that segment KB is congruent to segment BM. Okay, sorry, my pen is not cooperating. All right, so then a bisector, here I have a segment DE. I'm going to make this the midpoint. I'm going to put my markings on there so I show that F is the midpoint, and then it can be a line, ray, or segment. So if it's a line, we could say that line is going to go through point F, through the midpoint. If I want to make it a segment, then I can say here, FA would be a segment, and it could be a ray. So let's do this. I could say, okay, here's ray, FX. All right. What's the important part when you draw a bisector? You have to put the markings on there to show that the two segments are congruent, because then that tells us you're understanding that it bisects the segment at its midpoint. Now let me add in here, just so you have it in your notes, a perpendicular bisector. Figure is going to look a lot like the one above. Here's my segment, ED. My midpoint is at F, so I'm going to put my congruent markings on those segments. And then if it's perpendicular, though, I have to make sure that that bisector actually looks like it's perpendicular to segment DE. So what do? I have to put in my marking to show that two segments are perpendicular. Okay. Finding the midpoint. Okay, so we know what the midpoint is. Cuts a segment in half, but we can actually find a value for it. The midpoint, a plus b divided by 2. A and b are the coordinates of the endpoints of the segment. And if we're adding two values together and dividing by 2, we're just finding the average of the coordinates. So find the midpoint of segment AB if A has a coordinate of 12 and B has a coordinate of negative 20. So our midpoint, we add the coordinates together. So 12 plus negative 20, and then I divide that by 2. 12 plus negative 20 would give me negative 8. Negative 8 divided by 2 would give me negative 4. So the midpoint of the segment, the coordinate would be at negative 4. So recall the difference between when we're on a number line. So here's B at negative 20 on the number line. A would be at 12 on the number line. So the midpoint, if we put 0 here, the midpoint would still be in the negative region. Okay? So there's my midpoint. So for each of these, determine the midpoint and the distance. Okay, so distance. Recall distance is the absolute value of the difference between the coordinates. Okay, so for the first one, midpoint, sum of the coordinates divided by 2, negative 10 plus 15 gives me 5 divided by 2. So the midpoint would occur at 2.5 on the number line. And the distance, we set up our little goalposts here. So our notation for distance, the two capital letters next to each other, no symbol on top. Absolute value of the difference. And now I'm just going to plug in my coordinates. So negative 10 minus 15. So I have the absolute value of negative 25. So the length of the segment, the distance between the endpoints, is 25 units. Okay, so you have 3 more on your worksheet. Complete those for me. I'll check those in class. On the next page. On the next page. Get rid of this. Okay, let's finish there and we'll do the remaining problems. We'll talk about those terms and draw the diagrams in class. Okay, so the only thing you have to finish are numbers 2, 3, and 4. Determine the midpoint and the distance of each set of points.